Welcome everyone to this IES webinar, Perspectives on the Impact of Rapid Urbanisation on Air, Land and Water. This webinar has been organised as part of the IES's Future of ES23 Horizon Scanning and Foresight project, which you can find out more about on our website. We're really pleased today to be joined by three speakers who are going to be exploring the megatrend of rapid urbanisation from three different environmental perspectives. As usual, after all three presentations, we will have time for questions. So please do put these in the Q&A option at any point during the presentations, and these will then be read out on your behalf later on. We're going to hear from all three speakers first, and then we'll have around 30 minutes for questions at the end. If your question is for a particular person, please do specify this in your question. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on the IES YouTube channel. So let's get started right away. So I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Craig Llewellyn, Associate Ecologist and Policy Specialist at Atkins, with 12 years experience in ecological consultancy and policy decision making. Thanks very much for joining, Craig.
Great, thanks very much. So yeah, today folks, we're going to be talking about Biodiversity Net Gain and the role that Biodiversity Net Gain might play in rapid urbanisation. With urbanisation, we know that comes the need for increase of housing, expansion of urban areas, that really does put pressure on our biodiversity. And as we know, we've got such long-term declines in wildlife across the country. Any tool we can use to try and reverse this is welcomed. So it's really vital for planners and practitioners like yourselves that we develop an understanding, I think, of BNG. So this short webinar will include what is BNG, how is it being implemented, particularly amongst rapid urbanisation, what lessons have we learned so far in the industry, and what can we expect from the government, given this is going to be mandatory later this year, what we can expect from them. Next slide, please. A little short overview of who I am. So yeah, as Ethne said, yeah, I'm an associate ecologist at Atkins. I've spent the last 10, 12 years or so as a consultant ecologist. But on top of this, I've been involved in policy implementation across the UK. I primarily do work with the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management and Wildlife and Countryside Link, which, for those that don't know, it's a coalition of 67 organisations, which include the Wildlife Trust, National Trust, WWF, amongst others. And my role within this is basically being on the forefront with key advisors in government and NGOs, and basically looking at what new upcoming policy and legislation is on the horizon within our industry. Recent examples have included the Environment Act, which was then the Environment Bill, working with lawyers and policy advisors on that. And then more recently, things like the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. But ultimately, my core aim is to ensure that consultant ecologists and environment professionals like yourselves have a say in what the future of our legislation looks like, given how important that is, particularly in the middle of a biodiversity and climate crisis. It's important we have the right legislation in the right place. Next slide, please. So these are the four questions I ran through at the start. So I won't repeat them again, but yes, as you can see, there's four main key questions we're going to talk over today. Next slide, please. So what is biodiversity net gain? As you can see, it's development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. And really, it's quite simple. As I said, really, the growth of housing development, particularly in urban settings, there's more pressure on green spaces and wildlife. So having a tool to combat this, particularly with the biodiversity and climate crisis, if it's implemented correctly, BNG can be a good thing, I think, and if it's done accurately. And of course, there's wider benefits, as you can see. Health and well-being and others. You know, it's not just biodiversity, there's a wider picture to all of this. And the main levers that Biodiversity Net Gain are being implemented on is we've got the Environment Act, which many of you know. So we've got our 10% Biodiversity Net Gain. That will also include nationally significant infrastructure projects. So that's really big projects like HS2 amongst others. And there'll be a lot of secondary legislation as well to come with the Environment Act. And even in things like the 25-year Environment Plan and the National Planning Policy Framework both support biodiversity net gain. One thing I will say quickly is that it's really important to know that biodiversity net gain does not supersede or change any of our existing legal protection for different habitats and species that we currently have. And ultimately, in line with the mitigation hierarchy, it's about avoiding those impacts first, then mitigating and compensating as a last resort. There's companies that already have a percentage gain within their industry. So the Environment Agency, for example, have committed to 20% biodiversity net gain. National Highways, or used to be Highways England, also have quite a big commitment as well. So this is already in place in some areas. Next slide, please. And this is the tool we use essentially for measuring biodiversity net gain. It's called a biodiversity metric, and it's a tool that basically audits the value of biodiversity on land. So it gives an understanding of what is on that site, what will be impacted and lost, and then the other end calculating what compensation is needed. So what do we need to recreate once the development's gone in and affected those habitats? What do we need to have in place post-development? And that biodiversity metric 3.1, that's the current industry standard, but it's been updated a few times over the years as it's sort of been tailored. Next slide, please. And this is it really simply. So it uses something called biodiversity units, which I'll go over how those units are formed in a second. But this is it. So you have your you have your post biodiversity unit, so afterwards minus what was there before, and then you have that net change. So it's comparing essentially to what you have prior on site and what's there afterwards, and seeing whether you have this gain. So it's as basic as that, but there's some maths to it that I'll go over briefly. But yeah, as you can see, yeah, that's the basic idea of it, is looking for that gain, that 10% gain in units. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is the sort of formula. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because it is, even as an ecologist who's been using it a while, it's quite complex. It's quite hard to pick up in some ways, but it's a calculation basically. And within that calculation, there's different multipliers. So the blue ones you can see on your screen, those are the scoring card ones basically. So distinctiveness, so is the habitat on site. So that looks at how rare the habitat is, and that gives it a score, and I'll go over that in a moment. The second main one there on is condition. So each habitat parcel has a condition that it's in according to its habitat type. So poor, poor, fairly good, and so on. And then the strategic significance one is having the right habitat in the right place, essentially. And again, I'll go over these in more detail. And the risk multipliers, the ones in red that you see, these are the challenges. So those are the challenge of recreating those habitats. So there's three things there, three criteria we use for that. Difficulty of creation, so how easy is it going to deliver that habitat? The spatial risk, how far is it from the original site that it was lost? And then the third thing on there is the temporal risk as well, which looks at how long it takes for that habitat to reach that condition. So that's the general formula, timing those together, and you get your units. And then, like I say, the red ones are more basically lower scoring, because those are the challenges basically to get your score up, because those three things obviously influence what you're creating. So they carry quite a weighting post development score essentially. Next slide, please. So go over the three main ones. So we've got the distinctiveness, and as you can see on that screen, you can go anywhere from 0 all the way up to 8. And that is the quality of the habitat on site. So you might have a very typical building with some hard standing that obviously, as habitat value goes, it's very little. And as you move up, you might have agricultural land that's been influenced and sort of intensive agriculture, so still fairly low. Then you can move up the scale all the way up to habitats that are of international importance, like your lowland fen there, for example. So it builds its way up, but basically that is the quality of your habitat that's there. Next slide, please. condition. So this is essentially, like I say, it's a scoring system, and this is where you look at the condition of the habitat. So this is linked often to past and present management. So for example, you might have a habitat that was in good condition, but agricultural practices have degraded it, or invasive species have come in and again degraded that habitat. So again, you get a score. This one's between 1 and 3, 1 being poor, 2 moderate, and 3 good. And there's a whole criteria that we have then to look at that condition of habitat. Next slide, please. Strategic significance. So this is basically where looking at whether the habitat is in an ecologically desirable place, or designated in a local plan. So a local plan might say X number of a type of woodland, yew woodland or something, that's in the plan, so that's going to score higher on the category. And I'll go into this a little bit later, but there's something called nature recovery networks, which are like a spatial plan that map out a local authority, and within that you can actually look at the best opportunities, where you could highlight where your BNG opportunities are essentially. And I'll talk a little bit more about a bit of that later on, but a lot of it's ongoing. The standards are ongoing in terms of the strategic significance, those maps you can see, but all of it can link to, will link to BNG delivery. And the score on that is weird, strangely, it's between 1, meaning it's not in a local plan, that habitat on site, it's not considered strategically important, and then it goes to 1.1, again strange, I'm not sure how that was worked out, and then to 1.15, so there's the 3 on that. So 1 not being good, 1.1 ecologically desirable but not great, and then in the local plan. But this is totally tied to strategic significance, so not to get mixed up with the others that I've just pointed out. It's not about the quality of the habitat, it's just simply about where it is and the value it has, in terms of its being in the right place essentially. Next slide, please. So like I said, this really is very much a quick overview of the metric and how it works. But so here's a very quick example on the baseline side. So we've been out on site and we've got overall, with say the site is 5 hectares, it might be 5 hectares of grassland that might be lost. On the scoring scale, it's been given a 2 for distinctiveness, so the habitat is not great as quality goes. Condition, the condition of itself of that habitat is pretty good, so let's say no invasive weeds, pretty good, pretty good standard. And the strategic significance, like I said, is 1 in this case. So it's not in a local plan, it's not strategically important in that sense. Obviously, I've put NA next to those 3 there because those come into the post-development score. But ultimately, what I want to try and show you, and this is obviously quite a whistle-stop tour of this. So you've got those have worked out, as you can see, as 30 biodiversity units by timesing those together. If I was to fill out the post-development score as well, and like I say, it does get a little bit more complicated on the post-development score. In order to reach 10% gain, if you had 30 units pre-development, you'd obviously need say 33 post-development in order to reach that extra 10%. And obviously, as you work out the calculation, if you start times them together, so again, we'll use the baseline score, 5 times 2 times 3 times 1 is 30. But if you go the other side to the post-development, as you move down to those 3 bottom ones, difficulty of creation, the more difficult the habitat is to create, the lower the units go. So if you keep timesing it, obviously 0.1, you see what I mean? It will keep moving the number down rather than up. So that's obviously to ensure that ultimately, folks, is that when this calculation's worked out, that you're not trying to recreate habitats that aren't recreatable or aren't recreatable within a certain time frame. So it penalizes you for essentially getting rid of habitats on site that are very difficult, very unique, very, very important habitats. So it sort of penalizes you in that sense. So I appreciate this. That's a very quick run through of how that works, but I want to go on to a few other things before we finish. But my key takeaway message for you out of that is that there's a lot of factors that are taken into consideration but ultimately it needs to be modeled so that not only are you creating habitat of that same size, but what you're replacing, you're replacing what is lost in terms of making sure the quality of that habitat is upheld, and that it can be recreated within a period of time that is feasible. And there's trading rules in place around this, but essentially that's a brief overview for you on the calculator and how it works. Next slide, please. And then this was really just to show you the importance of the mitigation hierarchy, really, and that when it comes up to irreplaceable habitats like your ancient woodland and designated sites, these really should not be in the calculation. They need their own bespoke compensation and should be avoided altogether. This is not about putting the best habitats at risk. And like I say, the calculator favors to the fact that if you do start trying to recreate habitats that really shouldn't be within that realm, then you will be penalized for it, and you won't get the units and you won't get the gains. And like I say, this will be mandatory, this net gain, from November this year. So I think it's important that as an industry, a wider industry, we get this right. Next slide, please. So how is biodiversity net gain currently being implemented, given the pressures over land value and the predicament we're in with such an expansion of urban areas? Green space in itself is becoming more stretched, but never mind making that green space essential for wildlife. So there's three essential ways, but it's mostly two ways, sorry, that it's being delivered. But on-site is one of them. So if you've got a housing development, the habitat would need to be left aside, bespoke habitat, an individual parcel of land from that calculation that I went over. But essentially, it might be part of a landscape plan or a green infrastructure plan. It's not quite a separate, you might be able, depending how it works, you might be able to have, there might be a stacking of habitat. So you might have something that the landscape team want to do, but they're working with the ecologists to ensure that biodiversity is there, but it serves, the biodiversity gain is there, but it serves a multi-purpose, if that makes sense. It's a very fine line on this, and it's a sticking point around making sure that there's genuine gains and that they're not gains and they're just being tied up in something else. So and it's something we hope to have more guidance on when it becomes mandatory. Off-site is another way, which is more difficult, as you can imagine, because there needs to be an agreement in the long term on how that site is going to be managed. And eventually the government are going to have a registered land for off-site biodiversity net gain. So there will be a register for logging where net gain is being implemented. So there is strategies around this, but at the moment it's still a bit loose. Of course, you could tie it up with something like the conservation covenant, which is like an agreement off-site with a landowner and a designated body, like a conservation charity. So that land is set aside, preserved essentially for BNG, and that can be in an agreement. And as I say, it has to be in so I should have said it needs to be within a 30-year period. That's as part of the mandatory gain, that land has to be managed for a minimum 30-year period essentially. There's other things as well, like statutory credits that we're waiting on. So a system of statutory credits that will be invested basically. So credits can be bought by developers at a last resort when on-site and off-site provision of habitat can't be required. So it's like a credit scheme. But again, I can't give you too much more about that. It's a developing thing that will come as part of the secondary legislation when it becomes mandatory later this year. But so there's a few different ways of delivering BNG, but ultimately, personally for me, it's about ensuring that it's strategically relevant, it's connected to other wildlife habitat, and that actually we're going to see this retained and managed in the long term. And that particularly when you've got things like urban sprawl and other things, we need to make sure that is retained for the long term. So the agreements are signed up within that period, and we've got long-term gains in biodiversity. So I think that's what matters to me, and I'm sure it matters to many others as well on this call. Next slide, please. So it was just to give you a quick overview. I mentioned very briefly back there on the strategic significance that there are local authorities like Cornwall and the west of England that are implementing these nature recovery networks. And like I say, it's a plan that identifies best opportunities for delivering that nature's recovery, and B&G is very much can be tied into that. This will be used in other ways, but essentially it's a way of going, right, okay, you need some gains on B&G, you can't do it on site. Okay, well, we've got an off-site location here that's been established in this nature recovery network. We could potentially, that could be used as a site and stamped for long-term gain. So this is just another tool that could be used and ties in nicely with B&G. Next slide, please. And yeah, there's a huge swathe of guidance, as you can see, that we have in place for Biodiversity Net Gain. It's, you know, there's, for me, best practice is good, but we also need something called common sense. So using the guidance we've got, but making sure that we work well with other key stakeholders and other people to ensure that we can demonstrate real gain, essentially, and ultimately the best outcome for nature, because that's what we want. Next slide, please. And what lessons have we learned so far? So I guess the one I pointed out a few times, just ensuring that there's actual genuine gains on site. You know, and making sure that those are genuine gains and they're incorporated within the development from the outset and from the early outset, not in between or not thought of as a last thought on a development. Oh, we need 10% B&G. Where can we quickly fit it? So I think that's one thing I think that I've come across so far, is making sure that one, it's genuine, and one, that it is going to be followed through. And making sure there's no double counting. You might have some mitigation for a certain species, like for otter, say, or great crested newts, but there's the balance then between counting that water body creation, say for newts. Should that be counted the same as for B&G gain, or is that simply double counting? I think the other thing as well is ensuring the calculator is accurate. I gave you a very quick obviously tour of that calculator. Yeah, and there's a reason for that, is because it is quite a complex tool. Those are the main parameters that I showed you, those criteria, but there's a lot of guidance and there's a lot of information around it, and ultimately we don't want to make sure it's incorrect. We need to make sure it's accurate and that it's being applied correctly, because that could make a big difference between how much biodiversity net gain is created in terms of the units and so on. My other point, I suppose, is that communication is key. So ensuring whether it's water specialists for the sustainable water systems, aquatic ecologists, landscape architects, engineers, basically making sure that we all work together to get the end goal. Okay, and that is absolutely key. This cannot go on its own. It has to be part of the whole thing, basically. And obviously we're needed as well, working with getting ideas as well from particularly charities that have a lot of guidance on this, but working with, and even local people as well, you know, to make sure that we're doing this right. And lastly, as I stressed before, really, is that ensuring that the mitigation hierarchy is applied, because as I say, this is not to supersede any legal obligations or planning obligations that we have for our wildlife, for our habitats. This is in addition, and ultimately the irreplaceable habitats, like ancient woodland, like lowland bog, like even some of our rarer grassland types, they cannot be recreated, and they certainly can't be recreated within a reasonable time frame. So it's ensuring that those things are excluded from B&G and not included. And like I said to you, when I showed you that table, you get minus, the scoring goes down on the units, the more difficult it is to recreate, and rightly so, because yeah, I think that's very fair. Next slide, please. What can we expect from the government? We've got an awful lot to expect from the government. Here's some things on the side, on the right of your screen there, that we're still waiting. Things like the register, the Biodiversity Net Gain site register, having templates for Biodiversity Net Gain, habitat management monitoring plans. Like I say, there's a 30-year monitoring period that needs to be in place. We need more guidance on how this is going to be implemented, how it's going to work, making sure that everything is tied up nicely. But lastly, before you go, just to say that really that, you know, BNG is a long way before it reaches its maturity. It's actually in its very early stages, and it will take time. It's going to take case studies. It's going to take things not going well, and that's, as you know, that's how it works as scientists. Often things don't go well at first, and you figure out why it hasn't gone wrong, why it's gone wrong, and what you need to fix it. So it very much is in its maturity, but I'm hoping it will be a tool for the good in the future. So and that's me. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Ethne.
Thanks very much for that, Craig. That was great. And please do, all attendees, put your questions for Craig in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to those later. So thank you very much for that. Next up, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Xiangyu Sheng, a leading expert in air quality and climate change with over 25 years experience. And she is also an IQM committee member. So Xiangyu, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. So I was given the title to looking at urbanization and air quality. I guess the session today, I'm probably not going to too much technical details in terms of how we measure and model air quality and how we predict pollution levels and so on. So other than that, I probably give you an overarching view of where we are in terms of air quality around the world, and particularly in the UK. So I work at Temple. We are a specialist in environment planning and sustainability. So around our work, it covers all kinds of sectors in terms of infrastructure, urban development, energy, and so on. So we see many cases, air pollution, because of those developments, because of traffic, because of various activities. It's one of the, probably fair to say, it's one of the most important environmental issues we face in this era. So I had a look what urbanization actually means. Based on Europe Environmental Agency's definition, it's that the people, the population, more and more population living in the towns and cities, they're moving away from rural area. So this probably is a general definition of urbanization. So urbanization very often associated with people living in the city. There are many convenience kind of living in the city. You have access to many services, as well as transport. However, the density of the population is much greater than if you live in the rural area. So air pollution is not a new issue. In fact, if we're looking at major events in 20th century, it's not something new. It's arrived ever since Industrial Revolution. Basically, air pollution is associated with all human activities. For example, manufacturing, production, produce things, also transport, combustion, all the vehicles, and your heating. So we probably could say if there is carbon emission, very often you will have pollution as well, air pollutants. So if we're looking back the history, I think most of us probably aware 70 years ago, London's big smoke. However, even before that, there are various air pollution incidents. For example, in the 30s, which resulted in deaths. So thermal inversion is a condition where the cold air stay at bottom and the warmer air stay at top. So there is very difficult, it's in a situation, the pollutants are trapped, very difficult to disperse. And also in 80s, for example, in India, apart from the 55 London smog, industrial accidents resulted in deaths and injuries. So why we really consider air pollution? Perhaps we have taken that for granted because air we breathe, you don't have to think about it. So only when you're without it, if you can't breathe, then you realize something is seriously wrong. So air pollution is an invisible killer because people can almost take it for granted, as well as because it's invisible, it may not caught people's attention. So a fun fact, in fact, every adult actually breathes 15,000 liters of air every day, which we probably didn't realize. Air pollution can cause short or long-term diseases, the effects. And also, I think this year, potentially the media coverage on air pollution slightly seems less than previous year. However, COVID-19 actually is another wake-up call for people to realize, aerosol and the airborne diseases, the transmission, indoor air quality, and so on. It's very important. So one of the estimates is that it's cost UK economy 5 billion annually. So air pollution is a very serious issue. So we probably were, when you look at this, you probably realize it's the various pollutants we now regulate and looked in the So where are the sources of air pollution? So when we're looking at outside the window, looking at today, it looks like the sky looks quite clear. The pollution seems not evident. However, pollution, if you understand it, is actually only a symptom of the problem. The cause of that is all the human activities associated with it. So the source of pollution is very important for understanding the issue. So air pollution comes all aspects of the human activity. For example, energy industry, the power plants will have emissions such as PM, NOx, NO2, SO2. In the past, sulfur has been a problem, for example, for the coal burning. The manufacturing industry and the construction happening all around the world contributed significantly on the pollution. Industrial process, anything to be made, and the chemical plants and so on, also produce significant amount of pollution. Residential, where we live, heating and combustion produce pollution. The road transport is probably obvious one. We heard about Dieselgate, we heard the exhaust pipe pollution. Non-road transport may not be surprised. It is also providing pollution. Apart from that, some agriculture, for example, have biogenic aerosols and so on. So in addition to that, activities such as fugitive emissions, where you have a pair of materials, also the vehicle touch on the ground. You have those particulates generated from that. So the many fugitive emissions as well. So fair to say, what we're looking at now, probably the main pollutants, one of that is particulate matters, size from 10 micron to or PM2.5 or PM10, and NO2 probably quite still a problem, still an issue in the UK. Sulfur is not so much in the Western country, but in the industrial area, still a problem. And also ammonia, probably one of the things being looked at, particularly, for example, looking from agriculture as well. So just imagine when I did mention, so air pollution is invisible. So what if we can see it? If we can see air pollution, does that help us to realize how serious the problem is? This is just a favor of what city would look like if pollution is available. So this is London. London is actually not too bad. If we're looking at air quality index, it's around 25. So it's on the good side. So if it's visible, we probably can see, you probably can feel the more present on the pollution. In Seoul, the pollution index probably is almost double of London's. So you can see probably if it's visible, it will be feel more foggy almost. You can check the reference from this site. The reference is here. However, if you're looking at, for example, Istanbul, one of the holiday destinations, probably many of us visited in the past. If we're looking at air quality index going up around 550, 160, the city would be looking more ghostly. This is the high. If go over 200, that's become like hell. So Beijing, on a good day and a bad day, you can see how visible the pollution is. So air pollution is not the reason we really care about it, because it's have a significant impact on people's health from all different stages of life. For example, it can cause low birth weight if pregnant women exposed to the pollution. For example, have a quite impact on the children, can impact on the development. For adults as well, respiratory diseases, other diabetes, chronic, diseases, and so on, and also can affect elderly. It's affecting people through their lifetime. So people sometimes thinking, it's not so up to your face how air quality can impact on the life expectancies. In fact, one of the study actually show, for example, particulate pollution can reduce in average your lifetime by 1.8 years. It's actually more so than smoking, which is slightly shocking fact. In some other part of the world, it's even more serious. So for example, in India, the prediction is the life expectancy could be reduced 5 years because of the pollution is much more serious than other parts of the world. So you can check out this reference online as well. So if we look at Europe being viewed is in general, compared to other parts of the world, the air quality is in fact not too bad. However, if we comparing EU's air quality standards with WHO guidelines, the EU urban population exposed to the air pollutants above the limits is significantly different, because WHO guideline providing much strict limits value. The guideline value is much more strict. So we can touch on this later compared with UK's air quality limits. So air quality standards in the EU and the UK is still aligned. So if you look at this, you can also think, you know, if we use WHO guidelines looking at UK's population exposure to the air pollutants, the level is almost the same. So we get back to the UK, we look at around the world. Let's have a look. What's the air quality standards in the UK, and how we kind of go about in terms of legislation, how we manage an air quality problem here. So we mentioned early on, 1952, the London smog. That's probably one of the first very well-known incidents. So result from it, one of the good things come out of it is that UK published in a few years later, published one of the first world Clean Air Act. That's one of the first environmental legislation in the world being published. That's a wake-up call. People realized industrial revolution not only bringing more productivity, but also bring pollution. So at that time, it's estimated probably early deaths of 4,000 people because of London smog. However, if we're looking at 60 years on, 2012, the statistic looking at 13,000 early deaths. Looking at, for example, last year, 2020 will be 70 years of London smog. That number is not reduced much. So in 2013, so this is a landmark case in the UK. A little girl, age 9, called Ella, who lived just about 30 meters from the South Circular in London. She died because of acute asthma and induced by the pollution. So this was one of the first cases being ruled by the High Court, sadly on her death certificate, indicated pollution is one of the contributor to her death. That's one of the first case which pollution being recorded on the death certificate. So that is 2013, 61 years from London's from 1950s London smog. So in the UK in general, London is probably the worst place in terms of air pollution. So let's have a look. What's the air quality limits and objective value? We're probably mainly looking at annual mean here. Particularly matter, PM10 is 40 still. PM2.5 from 2020 used as 20 as annual mean, but previously is 25. We look at because all these target value now the dates to be maintained is passed. So now it's aiming by 2030. In many parts of the country in the UK, the limits value still exceeding. So it's still not meeting the legal limits. So that's why Planet Earth took DEFRA to the court, because many parts of UK still not fulfill the legal requirements in terms of meeting limits value. Nitrogen dioxide is one of the important urban pollutants. So if we're looking at annual average, it's also 40. There's issue about ozone, as well as, but I think sulfur dioxide is much less a problem in the UK now. So we're looking, those limits value, we're comparing that with WHO later. Because in fact, in terms of air pollution, there is no safe value. So no value can guarantee there is no health impact. 20th century, we see many legislation come into play in the UK. In the world, probably similar, the various more strict pollution requirements in terms of environmental standards. In the UK, probably starting off Environmental Act 1995, there are regulations, air quality strategy published 2000, new strategy 2007, as well as we just say early on, this air quality standard regulation, which 2010 as well. More notably, more recently, there are clean air strategy in 2019. As well as Environmental Act 2021, which one of the key components of that is the consultation of environmental target, which is not published as planned in October 2020, but is published just before the end of the year. One of the key things is to in terms of air pollution is to cut exposure to PM 2.5. So the proposed limit value is more strict, from currently 20 to reach to be implemented as 10 from 2040. 2040 is 18 years on. So some people will question, is this ambitious enough? And the population exposure reduction target, that's another important target brought in Environmental 2021, is to reduce exposure by 35%. That's compared to 2018. So let's look at WHO guidance value. For PM 2.5, WHO guidance value is 5. In the UK, from 2020 is 20. Here 25 is the older one. For the PM10, WHO guidance value is 15. In the UK is 40. And NO2 guidance value is 10. So in the UK, we still use 40, but guidance value, WHO guidance value is not a legal limit value for a country to follow, but that starts giving indication from a health impact point of view. A more strict limits value would actually help. So let's have a look in the UK. So from 1997, all the local authorities in the UK need to do a review and assessment, looking at in your area what the air quality is. If they are not meeting the limits value, not meeting objective, it needs to be declared as air quality management area. So if you declared air quality management area, then you need to develop a QAP, air quality action plan, to say how would you tackle the air pollution problem, how at which year, and how you'll be able to implement your mitigation measures to meet the standards. So currently in the UK, majority of local authority has declared AQMAs. This is the source from DEFRA. So nearly all the London boroughs has declared AQMAs. Some is covering whole borough, some covering most of the central area. So all the urban area, most likely, to be within air quality management area. Majority of the UK cities, all the urban area, declared AQMA, mainly because they can't meet NO2 limits value. Give you an example, a few years ago, Oxford Street, the NO2 measurements is over 100 microgram per meter cubed, where the required limits value is 40. So that's huge, huge difference. But recent years, that area, I think the air quality level has been improved because various mitigation measures being introduced, pedestrianising and so on. But if we look at UK, England have over 500 AQMAs. In most of the cities, there are AQMAs. So PM10 limits value, not many England cities outside of London, not too bad. Because of that, declared AQMA only have 26, some of the overlapping with NO2. But in London, have 28. London have a quite significant particular matter problem because of the density of the population as well. So we can see in the UK, probably to your surprise, many cities, many urban areas still not being able to meet the air quality standards. So how we assess air quality, I'm not going to go to details how we do that, but planning legislation and requires air quality as a material consideration. Many environmental impact assessment projects, if it's over certain criteria, air quality is also one of the key consideration when it comes to development, either infrastructure or property development. So when you look at air quality assessment, you're normally looking at sources where emission come from. You putting all the, either from point source, for example, industry or road source together form emission inventory. You were looking at those, comparing your air quality measurements to establish baseline. If you're wanted to predict the future, for example, air quality, whether it's going to meet standards or not, you usually use a dispersion modeling tool. So for a city, that's how the review and assessment being carried out. So if your prediction means you can't meet standards, you go back to your emission, looking at how could you mitigate, how could you reduce emission sources. So for example, London have ultra low emission zone. Many other, a number of cities in the UK have clean air zone and so on. One of the ways is to limit the traffic going to the center. So it's one way to mitigate, but probably not the only way. Probably I will sum up of this my talk today. I would like just to mention air quality and climate change perhaps can be viewed as two sides of the same coin. We know we are in a climate crisis, so climate change impact on air quality. Vice versa, air quality impact on climate as well. For example, extreme weather events, dry events, high temperature could make pollution worse. The air pollution, some pollutants as part of the greenhouse gas emissions as well. So for example, black carbon, aerosols and so on. So reduce carbon will have a benefit, also reduce pollution, vice versa, in most of the cases, majority of cases. For example, when we transition to a more renewable energy and more electrification and so on, that will help not only reduce carbon, but as well as can improve air quality, reduce pollution as well, because emission, very importantly, comes from the combustion and activities. So I thought just mention that. And also very importantly, I think indoor air quality has been probably in the past, probably not as high as on the agenda as ambient air pollution. But increasingly, it's more important. I think COVID-19 is also a wake-up call. So indoor air quality can come various places in the residential and workplace. So that's one thing need to be actually pay attention to as well. There are more work on that, and legislation requirements also become more important on that front. So I'm going to probably not talk too much now. Air quality is such a huge issue. So if you be interested, you can have a look on IAQM website or other places which we discuss various air quality issues, how we assess it, how indoor air quality, why it's important, how we go about. And the London plan has required air quality positive, which one of the aim is to really encouraging from the design stage as early as possible. So just sum up, UK still have a very serious air pollution problem, in particular in urban area. Climate and air quality are the coins in, two sides of the same coin. Importantly, prevention is very important, more than control. So get to the source. It's time to act now. So welcome further discussions and get in touch with me if you have any queries as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Xiangyu. That was really interesting to hear about the air quality perspective, and all attendees, again, if you have any questions for Xiangyu, please put them in the Q&A box. I'm going to go straight on and introduce our next speaker. So I'm really pleased to finally introduce Professor Simon Spooner, an environmental scientist applying scientific models compared with social, economic, political and regulatory methods to address the challenges that we face and help build better infrastructure systems. Thanks so much for joining us, Simon, and over to you.
Yeah, so Simon Spooner from Atkins. Ethne introduced me. My sort of core day job, as it were, is water and water quality and modelling of water systems. But I've had quite a varied career with almost half of that time spent in China and doing urban planning and urban environment projects, and now do quite a lot on climate change and things. So what I want to sort of talk about today is to look at sort of urbanisation, the trends that are happening, where we're going, take a water perspective on that. But I also want to look at it maybe from a slightly different angle, a different way of understanding maybe what sustainable development is, how we're moving on with concepts around that. Really, what is the urban form, urbanisation, and then how to change. And, starting from, or not starting from, but focusing on water. And I think the first thing to think about is also people just want water to work. They want the environment to work. They don't want to be too engaged. But we do have to do things to change to get the sort of services we want. But first of all, so I want to look at what we mean by sort of sustainable development, where we're going, particularly from the point of view of our place in the biosphere, which is a slightly odd concept, which I'm wanting to introduce here. But it's trying to think about, I'll go through a little bit our relationship with the rest of the world and how that's changing. So basically, so we, as a species, we used to live in the biosphere, part of it. That was what we did, what we were. But then we learnt to consume the biosphere, the world around us, to burn it, to clear it, and then to engineer and enhance our environment with agriculture. Initially, just sort of clearing some forest and savanna or a bit of fire and then planting some crops. And then this has become more and more and more mechanized and intensive. And now we're sort of combining our agriculture with our energy systems and the whole way in which we develop. The other huge trend we have had is how we have learned to sort of find and concentrate minerals, and also to use fossil fuels and fire to power what we're doing. But it's important to understand that much of the minerals that we use, iron ore, limestone, and some of the other metals, those were actually originally concentrated by biological systems. They are biosphere products. It was the evolution of photosynthesis. Limestone is the bodies of dead animals. Coal is a product of past living creatures. And much of our fossil fuels are a result of past biospheres which have been left as a treasure to us, which we are now burning. And we have learnt to burn that intensely and with great control, releasing all sorts of power and heat and intense energy that we can use to produce all sorts of different products, sort of glassworks, cement, iron. All these things require this sort of intense combustion process, and also to be able to move and build our cities. The result of this, and really particularly our capturing combustion, was a massive increase in population. So going back 200 years, you could see 1 billion people, very, very slowly increasing, and then suddenly, just within the last generation, huge increase. Interestingly, also great reduction in poverty. Most of the people in the world now live in relative wealth and comfort. There are still poor people, maybe it's increasing, but compared to 200 years ago, where almost everybody lived in abject poverty and very, very limited resources and just a tiny elite at the top. So it's been a huge boon. This has given us great wealth and power and advantage. We are living in something of a golden age as a human, but we have this consequence of pollution and impoverishment of the natural world. But what we have got in return for this, and it's important to remember this, is knowledge. We have, because of our ability to use combustion and fire to give ourselves more comfortable lives, we can spend that time learning. We have learned how to use these powers, and we have used them to build this infrastructure. So we have spent this wealth in a way. And we do have good things, and we have given those good things around the world. So from thinking of that sort of concept, this is just sort of reminding what a biosphere is, which is the whole of everything that's living in the ecosystem, or atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere. Together, those are that biosphere. So what is the sort of the way forward? How do we get the benefits we've had from our exploitation of the world whilst becoming more sustainable, being part of it? Well, first of all, we've got to stop consuming the biosphere. Everything we do, we need to think about not taking it from the biosphere. Instead, we need to be embracing and enhancing our relationship with the biosphere. And this is a very different concept, because consuming is also when you clear away the land. And we have to work together with the biosphere. But how do we do this in terms of energy, which is one of the most destructive things which we're doing? I introduced the concept that we have to bypass the biosphere. So all that fossil energy that's come through the biosphere, biomass, burning wood, all this is through the biosphere. But when you go to renewables, nuclear energy, you're effectively bypassing the biosphere. You're taking your nice, happy solar heat and energy, and through wind, or direct solar, you're turning that into electricity. You can also use that heat in geothermal settings, either taking from the ground or putting heat and storing in the ground is an important part of our energy system. And of course, there's nuclear, which bypasses the biosphere. So we can switch to energy systems which are no longer consuming those resources. Instead, we can focus on embracing the biosphere. So what does this mean? It means going beyond. It's not just a few nature-based solutions or a bit of organic farming. We have to really embrace working with complex, diverse biosystems. being stewards of multi-species communities rather than sort of engineers and of our environment. And that means sort of creating these complex systems and getting these symbiotic gains. There's a whole world to discuss on that, which I won't go into. That other aspect I mentioned is enhancing the biosphere. And in some ways, it's almost counter to the other one in a way. But this is where you're using some of that energy, which you get by bypassing the biosphere, putting that back into biological systems and massively increasing their productivity. And for water, a classic example is the activated sludge process, which we use to clean water. This uses a diverse ecosystem, which we put more energy into and can therefore get more productivity. Same with many fermentation processes, and increasingly with agriculture, we can start to go super intensive and get more out. Now, we're talking about urbanization and water as our theme. So I want to also give a slightly different perspective on what urbanization is and the urban form. Most important thing to think of is, and as Xiangyu mentioned, what we're looking for from our urban space, it's the services that it provides, is space, warmth, and security, primarily. We also have to be able to have our livelihood there, to obtain food, have water, to have something to our work, and to be able to sort of store things, including ourselves, and also importantly, community and communication. So that is what our cities are for. Now, this very strange slide, suddenly jumping into, is to think about how an urban form comes about. And I start off thinking of of wasps, bees, ants. They have a built environment. That built environment is defined by certain rules that they apply. And different species have slightly different rules. The emergent result is slightly different built environments for them. Humans are the same. We're a bit more complicated, but if you change the rules of our environment, so you get a different built environment. So a classic example is the 1916 zoning resolution in New York, which said how you have to allow light down to street levels and things. And this totally dictated a lot of the form of New York City. And you could see the cathedrals that arose around Europe in the medieval period. This was because of cultural aspects of the time and rules and economic structures that over hundreds and hundreds of years led to the evolution of this particular urban form, which has existed and remained to this day. So it's just a different way of looking at how, when you change the rules, lots of other things change. And just as Craig was saying with Biodiversity Net Gain, you start changing these rules and these metrics, so you'll start to change the urban form. And some of these changes, examples, as we went from hill forts, medieval cathedrals, those New York rules versus LA, where the drivers were more to do with transport, you get a very different urban form. London, Washington, Paris, these are diplomatic cities. You want to impress people and have grandeur, so different priorities. And as the technologies change, horse and cart goes to train, goes to car, that changes the form of the city. Now we can have continuous autonomous vehicles and hyperloops and new technologies coming in, which can yet change that form of the city. And you've got examples of that, such as NEOM in Saudi Arabia, which are being built and designed around these technologies, not these technologies. Our energy use in the city, we go from open fires, central heating, with coal fires in between and all the air pollution problems that has gone and have reduced and can go further with. These change our city. And another one, also it's a strange one to light, is looking at how we move from being very biosphere consuming to being less so. So the primary source of lighting oil in the UK 200 years ago was whale oil. We consumed whales. We didn't have mineral oil, and this was a major resource, which we spent a lot of effort getting, burns with a nice bright light. The whales were basically saved by town gas and the ability to light buildings using gas, and also they definitely couldn't sustain the level of exploitation of the incandescent bulb, now the LED lighting. So the amount you consume changes as your technology changes, your service is improving. So what we need to be looking at is how do we, bypass the biosphere. Got to move our energy systems, got to move our material systems, going to recycling and harvesting rather than primary extraction, and also moving that land use regenerative. You can see where a sort of sunny uplands vision might be, but you've got to get there, and you've got to have transition steps and work out the stages that you go through that, which may be, still having combustion but mitigating the emissions. You still have some primary extraction, but you want to reduce that and increase your recycling and circular economy. You're not going to quite get your biosphere embracing. It's going to take a long time to get that working and really understanding. Craig was explaining some of how we can work with biosystems in our cities, but we've got so much to learn that would be a huge advance. So what about water? So I'm supposed to talk about water. So let's look at it in that context. One of the things I also think is there's really no such thing as a shortage of water. There's just a lack of infrastructure and energy. You can have as much water as you want, anywhere you want, if you put enough effort into it. May not be realistic, but it's worth bearing in mind. Also, you can't solve your water resources problems generally by demand management. People want to have water, and as cities grow and more people come in, you need to be able to provide that water. We also need to consider the system, and as I go through a little bit of analysis, we'll do this looking at the resource, the supply, the use, and the recycling, and bringing that in as a circular system all the way around. You need to consider your infrastructure at the building level, the urban area level, and also the catchment level. And we also need to consider not just the water, but the materials that are in the water, the dissolved salts and pollutants and sediments and solids and different things, the nutrients, which can also have a very important role with agriculture and green infrastructure, and also the heating and cooling. And I'll come on to this. Heating and cooling can be a very increasing role for water systems. So in our water resources management, what might we change? How are we going to do things differently? I think thinking a lot more about improving the catchments, like natural flood management, water quality management at catchment levels, understanding how changing the permeability, evapotranspiration, how this can increase or reduce or change, or certainly change the water resources yields from different catchments, and even at a large scale, the weather systems. Our great fear of the Amazon: you cut too much down, it'll stop raining altogether. It won't be a rainforest anymore. So you need to maybe change some of those rules around environmental land management and look at that differently. And also in water treatment, I think a lot more emphasis on nutrient management and purification. We both at the land, stopping some of much of the pollution from agricultural activities that are getting into our rivers, and also going much further on some of our treatment. I think in terms of water supply, I don't see a sort of totally dramatic change. Pipes full of water are quite a good system, but maybe we don't have to have, we're trying to work, we're realizing there are many residual pollutants in our water, hormones, forever chemicals and things. Maybe we should have a little more emphasis on purification in the home, like a final filter of the water that you actually drink, rather than trying to remove everything from all of the water. I think we need to get a lot more rainwater capture, because with more urban nature-based features, we need to get a lot more water for those, and maybe linking more into agricultural systems, regenerative agriculture within our urban fabric. So the cities are much more embracing of the biosphere. We're getting food from our local environment, and we need the water systems to work with that. So it's sort of linking that biological urban infrastructure with our water system. Then on wastewater collection, like the pipes that supply us of water, Thomas Crapper, the flushing toilet, wonderful invention. There's been lots of attempts to see if we can come up with more sort of sustainable alternatives to that, and they don't generally get very popular. So we do have that basic technology of flushing sewers and washing stuff down, which works, but we need to stop. I think we almost need more focus on stopping leakage in sewers than in the water supply network. People are very obsessed with stopping leakage in the water supply. Really, if you increase the resource, it's not the most efficient way to make more water resources available, and it's not the biggest problem that we have. Whereas excess leakage into sewers leading to too much overflow into rivers, too much stormwater getting into sewers, and pollution from the sewers getting into aquifers, these are possibly bigger problems than the water supply leakage. And then on treatment, I think we need to be going fully circular, really extracting more and more products, especially nutrients from our wastewater, getting some of the energy out of it. It's worth bearing in mind there's more heat energy in wastewater than there is biosolids energy. So there's a lot more that we can take from that. And we also need to get towards recirculating the water that we've purified and putting that back up into the headwaters to increase our resources. And this is the biggest way in which we could increase the resources that are available to us. So just to give some examples now of where we've tried to systemize those principles into a design for a water system. I mentioned NEOM, and the line, this building designed around hyperloops. And this is sort of the early schematics of how you would develop a fully circular water system for that, how you would develop the sort of digital models which will be required in order to understand and make that work, and how to get those sort of levels of reuse, and also to integrate it with the green infrastructure aspects of your planned city. Then I mentioned about combining building use with the urban area, and I think having much more interaction between the water that's used in buildings and recycled and goes out into the green areas around it, what effects that has in terms of providing ecosystem services within the city, and then introducing crucially here the role of heat and recovering heat from water, and also using water as a heat carrier. This, I think, is something which can become a massive new utility. I think the only way we're going to decarbonize our urban building stock, instead of having gas boilers heating them, we need to be using heat networks, capturing solar heat, storing it in ground sources, extracting heat from rivers, extracting heat from sewers, recovering from data centers, recycling that heat. And with this sort of infrastructure, we can start to remove ourselves from being reliant on fossil fuels and biomass and things to heat and cool our buildings. So I think that's a very important area that needs to develop in future. And the technology is changing. District heating systems have been around a long time. These tend to be high temperature networks, quite centralized. But there are now, using heat pumps instead of heat exchangers, you can have much lower temperature networks that don't need to be insulated, where you can have multiple sources putting heat into it at lower temperatures, sort of 20, 30 degrees. The main network may be a sort of 15 to 20 degrees, but you can still extract from that higher temperatures into your building. You don't need to change the building fabric. You don't have to completely massively insulate your building. You can leave the buildings more or less as they are, same heating systems, but putting that investment into being able to obtain that heat, harvest it from the environment, and this can make a huge difference to the total energy use of your cities and urban areas. So I think this is one of the most important changes we need to enact. So just to summarize what I was going through, I was looking at megatrends for urban water, went through looking at, what does sustainable development really look at, maybe a slightly different angle on that, with concepts around our relationship with the biosphere, how we have to sort of move away from combustion by bypassing the biosphere, not taking our energy from it, and also in terms of embracing in our land use and working as part of that biosphere. So it's not going back to how we were as indigenous people within the biosphere. It's totally different from that. It will be, we would need digital twinning systems to understand these very, very complex systems which we would need to work with, and we need to change our models of how we work with biological systems, because they're complex, and we need to change that. I want to look at what this means for water infrastructure that supplies the cities and how it's used and circulated within the cities, how you're considering water together with the minerals which move with it, and crucially the energy that moves with water. How we can move towards more ecological systems, both in our urban spaces and in the catchments around us, and how the energy carrier aspect of water, I think, will become increasingly important for transforming the energy use, one of the primary energy uses within our cities. So having said that, we've got a bit of time for discussion. I'd be really interested in ideas on how or what we might need to do to transform our current water industry to be able to deliver this sort of change. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was a really interesting presentation, looking at some really tangible changes that can be made to the water sector in the light of rapid urbanisation. So thank you very much for that. That was great. We do have a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to kick straight off with some questions that have been coming through. I'm going to start off with one for you, actually, Craig, which is thinking about biodiversity net gain in practice, in particular the role of monitoring in biodiversity net gain. So how will we know what works and what doesn't, given the quite large timescales involved? And how can we certify whether it's actually been delivered? And if things go wrong, how can we enforce any changes?
That's a very good question, whoever sent that. I think the answer is, on the monitoring point, unfortunately, it is just going to take time, like I say, because it's not in its maturity yet, and it is so new. You know, like I said, there'll be habitat management monitoring templates and things that we can use, but only time will tell on that point. I think on the enforcement point, that's also quite a good point as well. Enforcement is an issue when it comes to wildlife legislation. We know that we don't have the enforcement on our statutory sites like our SSSIs that should be there. And again, we're leaning on the government really on like I say, we're waiting for that response before it becomes mandatory in November in the Environment Act. And I hope that there'll be sections in there on enforcement as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Craig. And just a kind of follow-up question to that is, obviously you talked about on-site BNG and off-site BNG. In rapidly urbanizing environments, how feasible do you think on-site BNG is going to be?
I think it will be. I think the answer is it will be feasible. I mean, like I said, it will be legally binding, that net gain. So in November, it will be mandatory for that 10% net gain. So developments that fall under that, under something called the Town and Country Planning Act, will need to. There's no way about it. They'll have to deliver that BNG. I think in very urbanized environments, thinking about places like in London in particular, where I used to live a few years ago, I think one, it's more difficult. Certainly, it's going to be more challenging, and it's going to raise my point more, I think, about working with landscape architects and other professionals to get that gain in place. But by all means, it will be tricky.
Thank you. Great. Simon, I've just got a question for you as well. So you had an interesting point in your presentation about there not being kind of a shortage of water, but it's more about a shortage of infrastructure. So I just wondered what your perspective was on the kind of situation that we had in the UK last year with the kind of drought and things like that. And what do you think some of the infrastructure challenges were there, and how could we change them to make it more resilient?
I think the first thing to note is how far advanced we were. It was a pretty severe drought, not quite as severe as 1976, but not that far off it. And yet we had far, far less problems with water shortage. Nobody was on standpipes or, you know, and there were very, very few people who were actually heavily restricted in their water use. And that's because the infrastructure has moved on a long way. Lots of people have studied this problem. There's been huge, huge investments to provide greater resilience in our water systems. And that is ongoing greatly now. And we have strategic water resources plans. But if you want that resilience, primarily you have to build that infrastructure. You have to be able to move water from where it is to where it isn't. And having interbasin transfer schemes from the Severn to the Thames to have more storage and new reservoirs to be able to recharge aquifers better and to have better use of that, can greatly help. That requires investment and it requires energy to pump water around. I think that the biggest potential way to hugely increase the resources is by sending our treated water back up the catchments. We're rapidly extracting water from aquifers. We're taking it in from rivers. We're diverting it past the river and then sort of on a sort of a quick route to the sea in many cases. And we need to be attenuating that, putting it back up, and then there will be enough water for us. But it has to be at the right quality. So we have to put that effort in to make sure it's clean enough for that to work ecologically.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Simon. And I think a lot of the things you raised should be a separate discussion at some point, because so many interesting things to consider there. Xiangyu, a question that's coming through for you. Is microbiological air quality in a changing climate now as important for us to address as the traditional pollutants like PM, NOx? For example, the rise of respiratory viruses and fungal spores in our super insulated homes and public transport.
Yeah, certainly that's a really good point. Probably have not touched on in my talk. It's actually quite very important, in particular, that's affecting people's health. So there are European standards, particularly if you're looking at indoor air quality measurements and assessment, that's become increasingly important. We know there was a case recently, a child died, probably direct result from that pollution. So yeah, very important.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Sorry we didn't get through as many questions as we were hoping for, but it's been so great to hear about the different perspectives of land, air and water. So thank you so much to our speakers, Simon, Xiangyu and Craig. It was really great to have you here today. And thanks to all of our attendees for logging in. I hope you found that useful. And please do keep an eye on our website to stay up to date with our future of ES23 Horizon Scanning and Foresight project.